All right, good morning, everybody. Today we're going to continue on with the Chapter 15 notes. Today is fairly short. Tomorrow we will do the Iron Triangle, which is a tad bit longer. It's probably the most important thing in this chapter, so I want to stress that. We'll do that tomorrow. And then on Wednesday, you will have a quiz over Chapter 15 that will consist of 2 extended response questions, one about the Iron Triangle and one that kind of links some things in this chapter back to some earlier things. I do want to start with something that is a tad bit concerning to me that I wanted to address with everybody. This is a problem with, I will say, a decent number of you. And I know the writing prompts are something that is usually just an easy point just for check-in purposes. But I do want to stress something that I've been seeing in the writing prompt, because I saw it as well in the bureaucracy assignment that I graded, as well as some things from your tests. The expectation on the AP test this year is that students are going to be using their notes. Okay, it's 45 minutes. It's online. It's open notes. So the expectation is that you're going to have your notes out. They know that from the College Board. What you have to absolutely make sure you do, though, is you have to put things in your own words. Generally, most days for the writing prompt, when I asked you last week to define discretionary authority, literally probably half of you just simply copied word for word what was in the PowerPoint. Now, they're going to be running all student answers for this year's AP test through a plagiarism checker, which means that if you are looking up the answers in my PowerPoints when they ask you the AP question, and then you're using my words, if more than one of you does that, then the two of you are both going to be basically have your test invalidated for plagiarism. So you have to get in the habit of putting everything in your own words. You cannot do this anymore. So starting with today's writing prompt and moving forward, if your answers to the writing prompt are just simply copying word for word what I have in the PowerPoint, then I'm not going to give you credit for it. So you have to make sure that you're doing things the way you're going to be expected to do it in a month on the AP test. So please get in the habit of doing this. I know we've had some issues with this before this year, before we went on distance learning. You have to put things in your own words. Okay, you have to get in the habit of doing that. If you're just simply copying what's in the PowerPoint, you're going to fail the AP test. They're going to invalidate your test. So let's get in the habit of doing that now. Everything needs to be in your own words from here on out. Okay. All right. Where we left off last week, we were talking about the difficulty in getting rid of bureaucrats, why that's viewed by so many people as a negative of our bureaucracy, given that it's so hard to fire a bureaucrat. It's also something that whenever we have a change of president, where we left off last week, is that the executives have to kind of win over their staff. You have these career politicians who are there working in these bureaucratic agencies, and you looked up for that bureaucracy assignment. You looked up 15 of these. So this is people who work for the CIA. This is people who work for the IRS, who work for NASA, who work for the Securities and Exchange Commission. All of these agencies that are really, really important to the way our government functions. Whenever we have a new president, that president has to come in there and win over all of those people in order to get them to do what they want. Because if they don't, then the staff has all of these loopholes in place that kind of allow them to kind of go around what the president wants. So just kind of picking up where we left off, another big factor that kind of plays into our bureaucracy today is the people who hold those bureaucratic positions. Now, one of the important things that I want to stress here is the leadership positions versus the rank and file. So there's 6 million people who work for our federal government, and the vast majority of those, all but about 3%, are career politicians. Those are the ones that are there from president to president to president. That group of about 5.9 million people very closely resembles the population of America. So there's a roughly equal number of men and women. Minority groups are represented well in that. So as a rule, the civil service fairly closely resembles America as a whole. Now, the leadership of those agencies, however, does not. Most high-ranking people, these are the people who are either career politicians who are in the bureaucracy who get promoted up really high, or the people that the president appoints tend to still be white males. So the leadership positions within the bureaucracy do not represent America as a whole. The rank and file people do. And that's in part because of those tests. Those tests are designed to kind of level the playing field for the people who are trying to get jobs within the bureaucracy. And we have a wide variety of different positions that are available. Now, Generally, the people who head those agencies tend to be very liberal or very conservative. Obviously, Bill Clinton appointed a lot of very liberal people to head those agencies, Ronald Reagan, a lot of very conservative people. And because those presidents served for 8 years, they really had a chance to set the tone of those agencies and kind of influence the way those agencies worked over a long period of time. Now, we have agencies today that tend to be more liberal, and we have agencies today that tend to be more conservative just because of the nature of the people who work there and the nature of the things that those agencies do. If you look at groups like the EPA, okay, generally most people who get a job working for the EPA tend to have a degree in something like environmental sciences or something like that, and people who get those degrees tend to be more liberal than people who don't get that degree. Similarly, people who work in the Department of Commerce, Department of Treasury, tend to be economists or accountants. Those people tend to be more conservative. So generally, the people who get hired by a lot of these agencies tend to have similarities between themselves based upon what those agencies do and the types of degrees that people get. So we tend to have more liberal agencies. We call those activist agencies, like we saw with activist courts and things like that. Those would be things like the Federal Trade Commission, the EPA, the Food and Drug Administration tend to be a little bit more liberal. Agriculture, Commerce, Treasury, those tend to be a little bit more conservative. And again, that tends to do with the background of the people in those departments, the rank and file people who are there doing the work every day as part of that bureaucracy. Now, do bureaucrats sabotage their political bosses? And the answer here is absolutely, they do it all the time. Okay, so the people who work for the EPA, if they don't like what Trump asks them to do, or they don't like what the EPA director asks them to do, there are many, many ways that they can go around them, and they oftentimes do. This happens in every agency, to every president, all the time. Now, most bureaucrats do carry out the missions of their boss. I don't want to make this sound like of those 6 million people in DC, 5.5 million of them are going around their boss. That's absolutely not the case. But you do have people regularly in government who don't do what their boss wants them to because they don't agree with what their boss wants them to do. If you're very liberal and you're working in the EPA and you're following the orders of President Obama, and then Trump gets elected, you may not want to follow his orders because you don't agree with what his orders are. So you have ways that you can get around that. Similarly, when Obama became president, you had conservatives who worked in some of the Treasury Department, okay, Commerce Department, things like that, who didn't want to do what Obama wanted them to do. And they figured out ways to get around them. Now, how do you do it? Hey, you want to get around your boss? Well, there's a lot of ways you can do it. Well, the first easy way is you go to Congress. Congress funds your agency. So if you are today a Democrat working in the EPA and you don't want to listen to Trump, you go to the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives is run by Democrats. House of Representatives controls funding. So if the president wants to not fund a certain agency, the House can fund them anyway. And they can be very specific in terms of policy that they want carried out. Okay, if they get a bill passed from both houses of Congress, they can be very specific. And then the president doesn't have the ability to tell them not to do something. If Congress has specifically funded it and spelled it out in the bill what they want it done, that really limits what the executive branch can do. You also have members of the bureaucracy who go to the media. You hear all the time President Trump complaining about anonymous sources. And anonymous sources, for the most part, are real. Okay? If you are in government and you want to embarrass your boss, the easiest thing you can do is you can go to the media. Now, oftentimes what they are doing is drawing attention to something that the general public doesn't know anything about that might make the administration look bad. They did this all the time to President Obama. They're doing it all the time now to President Trump. So there are agencies who do this a lot. So if something could potentially be embarrassing, they're all the time going to leak that to the media to make that person look bad. If anybody saw that story with that Navy captain last week, Navy captain, there was coronavirus on one of his ships. He leaked it. He put out a memo, sent it out to the media. He didn't feel that his bosses were going to do anything about it. That went out to the media, really, really embarrassing to the leadership of the Navy. The naval commander fired him. Okay, the head of Secretary of the Navy, the acting Secretary of the Navy fired him. And after he fired him, there was a lot of backlash because of that. And the Secretary of the Navy resigned last week. So again, leaked a story to the media, embarrassed his boss. His boss fired him for it, okay? But in response, the boss ended up stepping down himself. So again, if you want to get something done, sometimes you have to go through irregular channels and ways to do it. The big thing that you can also do is you can go to interest groups. And interest groups, because they fund Congress, because they fund the president, they have a lot of power. And bureaucrats who don't necessarily need interest group funding, because they don't fund them, they oftentimes will go to interest groups to put pressure on one of these other two agencies. And this is part of the Iron Triangle that we'll talk about tomorrow. Or agencies might look for some sort of procedural reason not to do something. You ask me to do something, well, I don't want to do it. So I'm going to look for some little loophole, some bill Congress passed 8 or 9 years ago that says that my agency can't do a certain thing. I'll find some sort of loophole or some reason not to do it. So all the time the bureaucracy finds ways to get around their boss if there's something that they don't want to do. Now, this is a big piece. We saw this with President Trump during his impeachment. Has to do with the ability of people to do that. And in 1989, Congress passed what was known as the Whistleblower Protection Act. And what the Whistleblower Protection Act does is it protects bureaucrats from being punished by their bosses for reporting waste, fraud, or abuse in their agencies. Now, when Trump was getting impeached, there was all this discussion about, will they out the whistleblower? Will they announce who the whistleblower is? Well, according to the Whistleblower Protection Act, that person cannot be retaliated against for bringing forth information that could potentially be harmful about their boss. Now, Trump obviously didn't get impeached, but when independent agencies looked into the whistleblower complaint, they said that they were legitimate. So now if a person makes something up and they bring it forward, then they can obviously be retaliated against for that. But independent agencies looked at the whistleblower in Trump's case and said what they said was accurate. Therefore, that person cannot be harmed. So most mainstream media sources, even conservative sources like Fox News, for the most part, the exception of one or two of their nightly commentators, never released the name of the whistleblower. And the reason for that is they're protected. Whistleblower Protection Act says that you cannot target those people. Now, some bureaucratic positions, okay, a lot of them actually in Washington, D.C., are very low level. These are people who fill out forms, they do inspections, they may inspect farmers, they may inspect different agencies, they may work at the IRS, processing all of our tax returns, things like that. Those positions, it's very hard for people to interject their personal viewpoints. They usually just kind of follow the orders that they're given. Higher up bureaucrats have a little bit more flexibility, and these are the people who tend to be the ones that you hear speaking out about things. They're much more free to let their attitudes on different topics influence their jobs, and they're much more likely to speak out against their bosses. So, but make sure you know, Whistleblower Protection Act, really, really significant, particularly with the impeachment. So, given that they've obviously rewritten the AP test, the Trump impeachment is something that happened really, really recently. So this Whistleblower Protection Act is significant. You need to make sure that you know what that is, and that you can explain that. Now, in certain agencies, certain jobs are going to be much more likely within those agencies to get you ahead. So let's say you're working in the CIA and you get an entry-level job. You might get a job in DC doing paperwork. A lot of you pointed out in your bureaucratic agency's assignment, the CIA does a lot of research, information collection. If your entry-level job is doing that, you're in DC writing reports, chances are you're not going to get promoted as easily as somebody whose entry-level job is maybe working overseas, doing some sort of intel overseas or working with different countries. Those people have more opportunities. The same way with any job. You're more likely to get promoted if you're doing certain tasks than others. The same thing goes with government work. People who work in various agencies doing certain things are much more likely to get promoted. And some agencies, it's really, really hard for you to really make change in those agencies. What those agencies do is very, very structured, and you can't, if you're a lifelong bureaucrat or the head of that agency, you're really not going to make a whole lot of change there. If you look at the head of the FBI, that's a great example. We've seen that over the last few years. When James Comey was the head of the FBI, he was there tail end of Obama into Trump. He was doing different things with the agencies. Trump obviously fired Comey, brought in Christopher Wray, brought in other people to lead the FBI. Nothing's really changed. The agency does what the agency does, and the president and the leadership really doesn't have a whole lot of pull there, because what the FBI does has been so well defined over time that they really don't change a whole lot. Each agent does their own thing. They have very specific assignments, whether those are undercover assignments or things like that, where the leadership change really isn't going to change that. Similarly, State Department, they run all of our embassies overseas. There's various things that the State Department does in different countries, and it's very specific. And oftentimes what they do doesn't change. We've had a number of our embassies that have been attacked overseas. The most recent being the one in Libya, when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, that she took a lot of flack for in Benghazi. But it's not uncommon during the 80s and 90s. Our embassies were attacked in Africa, were attacked in the Middle East fairly regularly, because the State Department historically hasn't done a lot with security for embassies. That's been something that's been handled by other branches of government. And when that was kind of thrust upon the State Department, they really didn't know how to do it. And that left a lot of vulnerabilities for different things around our country. So the cultures of a lot of agencies don't change, and it doesn't change no matter who the leadership is. Now, 2 more slides when we're done. And I really just want to stress on this slide, there's really only 2 things here that I really want you to pay attention to. The book gives a lot of different constraints. There's 2 I want you to pay attention to. The first is that third one here called the Freedom of Information Act. The Freedom of Information Act addresses all government-related things that our government does. Nothing our government does is in secret. Okay, they cannot do anything at all that is behind closed doors, that is secret in any way. So this is why we have all of those C-SPAN channels. So if you're ever bored, and if obviously you guys have plenty of time right now, scroll up into the 300s or 400s. I don't know what channels they are, but if you scroll up into the 300s and 400s on your TV, you're going to see C-SPAN 1, C-SPAN 2, C-SPAN 3, and there's a ton of them. And the reason why those exist is that everything our government does has to be covered and has to be shown to you. So I'm looking at my TV right now. C-SPAN 1 is on 359, 360, 361, all of these different channels that all they do is show government meetings. So when our government's in session, they're showing meetings of the Agriculture Committee and the Commerce Committee and things like that. So if you want to know what one of these agencies is doing that day, you have the right to ask for it. You have a right to ask for the minutes of their meeting, things like that. And our government has to turn that over to you. Required. 100% required in order to turn that over to you. So Freedom of Information Act, you have access to everything. There are a couple exceptions to that. Obviously, they're not going to give you someone's personnel file. You can't ask for Trump's physical or something like that. And you're not going to get anything having to do with national security or anything that's confidential like that. But anything else, you have the right to have access to. So that's the Freedom of Information Act. Now, that was extended down to the states, and the book talks very briefly about this. It's something called the Sunshine Law, and I think I gave this example in class earlier in the year. The Sunshine Law basically extends the Freedom of Information Act to the states, such that no state entity can have any sort of meeting without making it known to the public. So if Northmont School Board, which is a public entity, wants to hold a meeting, they have to announce that meeting in advance so that people in the community have a chance to attend that meeting if they so choose. Same thing goes, like the members of our school board, if they decide they want to have lunch together and there's any more than 2 of them who are meeting together, that's a public meeting and they have to announce that in advance. So Sunshine Law, kind of an extension of the Freedom of Information Act. The second one on here that's important is what's known as the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. This basically says that anytime our government does anything, they must do an environmental impact statement on whatever their action happens to be. What is the impact of my action? Now, sometimes it seems completely ridiculous that you would have to do this. So let's say I pass a law giving money to Americans right now during the coronavirus outbreak. I still have to I have to submit an environmental impact statement with that bill, even though it seems to have nothing to do with the environment. But it actually does. There have been several studies that have been released in the last few weeks that have said since people have stopped working, particularly a lot of our manufacturing businesses, a lot of the pollution around our country has cleaned up. Around a lot of our big cities, it's disappearing. Pollution's getting better and better every day because people aren't driving as much, cities aren't doing as much. Now, does that mean that we shouldn't have factories? No. Okay, it just shows that there is some sort of environmental impact to this, even though this doesn't seem like it's an environmental thing that's going on. There's an environmental impact that goes along with it. When we built our new high school, we had to do an environmental impact study to kind of show what is the impact to the environment when we build this new school. Now, there are impacts. If you look at that house across the street on Crestway, right at the corner of National and Crestway, and you look at their front yard that floods horribly every single time it rains, that's happened from when we had our old school here, but it happens worse now. So that was an environmental impact of us building the school. Is the runoff from the school has to go somewhere, and it dumps across the street into that person's yard. So that was an environmental impact of that build. So those are things that can kind of restrict our bureaucracy today. It's a bunch of hoops they have to jump through before they're able to do anything. Okay, and what those things lead to is government doing things a lot more slowly. When our school was built, from our old school, there used to be a bus garage behind our school, way back in the 60s. When the original high school was built, the bus garage was behind it. And below ground, below our school, was an underground gas tank that they used for the bus garage. Well, when we went to build this new high school, lo and behold, that gas tank was still there. And when we went to do our environmental impact study, the EPA said, you got to remove that. You got to get rid of that. So we had to remove that gas tank, clean up any sort of leakage that had happened from that gas tank over the course of 40, 50 years. And that delayed the building of this school for almost 4 months from the fact that the EPA made us slow down because there was an environmental issue in play here. So government can force you to act slowly when things like that happen. And there's a lot of red tape, and that's the big thing that is associated with the bureaucracy a lot, is that the more constraints that there are to deal with, the more hoops people have to jump through in order to do things, and the more that they complain about it. So the government, the bureaucracy, definitely slows things down, and it makes it harder to get a lot of things done. Okay, stop there for today with the notes. Your writing prompt for today: discuss the process of firing a bureaucrat. Okay, why is it so hard? What are the hoops people have to jump through? And what are some ways to get around it? Now, remember, no copying word for word anything in my notes. If you're just copying word for word out of my notes, you're getting a 0 for the writing prompt. So remember, treat it like you would treat the AP test. They're going to give you a 0 if you're using word for word. I'm going to do the same thing. Okay, so talk about the process of firing a bureaucrat. Why is it so difficult? And what are some ways to get around that? That's your writing prompt for today. I will talk to everybody tomorrow. Have a good day.